the story of Mrs. Rosa, her daughter Lucia, and her grandchildren. In this special video, you'll uncover why living near your children in your later years could be impacting your happiness and well-being more than you might think, and how reevaluating your situation could completely transform your quality of life. You'll be surprised by the latest revelations. But before we dive in, pay close attention to this story. Understanding it will be crucial to grasp the powerful lesson ahead. Mrs. Rosa, a 70-year-old widow, decided to move in with her daughter Lucia after her husband's passing. The idea of being near her grandchildren and lending a hand around the house filled her heart with joy. After all, who wouldn't want to be surrounded by loved ones in their golden years? The prospect of a shared family life felt like a dream come true. Mrs. Rosa felt like she had hit the jackpot. The family honeymoon, when everything seems perfect. Days were filled with the joyful laughter of children, the inviting aroma of food in the kitchen, and the warm feeling of being needed. This is what life should be like, she thought, while making breakfast for her grandchildren. Her daughter Lucia's home had become a haven of intergenerational harmony. Mornings were spent over French toast and made-up stories, while afternoons were devoted to helping the little ones with homework. "Grandma, can you help me with math?" little Mato would ask, and Rosa's heart melted every time. In fact, a recent study from Stanford University revealed that grandparents who live with their children often experience an increase in happiness and a stronger sense of purpose, and Rosa was living proof. She felt more alive than ever, as though she had found the fountain of youth in her grandchildren's smiles. But, as they say, when something seems too good to be true, it often is. And this is where our story takes an unexpected turn. One afternoon, while Rosa was preparing dinner, she overheard Lucia on the phone. "Mom is a blessing," she said. "I don't know what we would do without her." Rosa felt a wave of pride. But there was also a twinge of something else, something she couldn't quite name. Was it concern? The philosopher Epicurus once said, "It's not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it." Rosa was beginning to feel the weight of every minute of her day being occupied. Where were the quiet moments to savor a good book or gaze out the window? Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, and the routine had taken over. Breakfast, homework, lunch, more homework, dinner. Rosa found herself thinking about her old apartment, about the freedom to decide how to spend her time. But then she would scold herself, "How can I be so ungrateful? I have everything I ever wanted." Then, one Sunday morning, as she was making Mickey Mouse-shaped pancakes, because really, what grandmother hasn't done that? Rosa realized she couldn't remember the last time she had slept in, or spent an afternoon with friends without rushing home to prepare dinner. Psychologist Erik Erikson spoke of the importance of autonomy in old age. Yet Rosa felt her autonomy slowly slipping away, buried beneath a mix of family love and silent obligations. One evening, after tucking the children into bed, Rosa sat alone on the porch, gazing up at the stars. She asked herself, "Is this truly what I want for the rest of my life?" The question lingered in the night air, unanswered, like a balloon drifting into the dark sky. Before we move on, if you're finding value in these stories, don't forget to subscribe and click the bell so you never miss an update. Mrs. Rosa began to notice subtle shifts in her daily routine, and soon, what once felt. The silent transformation from grandmother to unpaid nanny. What began as occasional visits to care for her grandchildren slowly morphed into a full-time commitment. Before she knew it, Mrs. Rosa was changing diapers, preparing bottles, and chasing after little whirlwinds of energy. Does this sound familiar? You're not alone. Epicurus once said, "Time waits for no one," and Mrs. Rosa was starting to feel the weight of those words. Her once lively days, filled with social events and personal time, were now completely absorbed by the needs of her children and grandchildren. But here's the curious part: Mrs. Rosa didn't complain. Like many grandmothers, she felt it was her duty to step in and support her family. Yet, as time passed, fatigue began to settle in, and with it, a creeping sense of loss that she couldn't quite put into words. This is where the concept of slave grandmother syndrome comes into play. No, it's not the title of the latest Netflix series, though it could be. It's a term coined by Dr. Antonio Garo to describe the emotional and physical toll grandmothers face when they take on unpaid caregiving roles. Imagine being on an emotional roller coaster. On one hand, you adore your grandchildren and cherish the time spent with them. On the other, you feel your own life slipping away, moment by moment, while you change yet another diaper. It's like trying to hug a cactus, beautiful, but painful. Research shows that this syndrome can have devastating effects on a grandmother's mental health. The lack of appreciation, combined with physical exhaustion and a loss of personal freedom, often leads to depression and anxiety. It's like running an endless marathon, but no one is waiting for you with a medal at the finish line. Mrs. Rosa began to experience these symptoms. She grew more and more tired, but kept telling herself it was just part of being a grandmother. But is it truly normal to sacrifice your well-being for the sake of others? Spoiler alert, it's not. Psychologist Carol Gilligan's work on the ethic of care highlights how women, in particular, tend to prioritize the needs of others over their own. Mrs. Rosa was living proof of this theory, sacrificing her time, her energy, and without realizing it, her happiness. As the days dragged on, Mrs. Rosa found herself staring out the window more frequently, longing for her former independence. She reminisced about the days when she could grab a coffee with friends without needing to ask for permission or juggle family schedules. Now, those simple outings seemed like an impossible luxury. It's ironic, isn't it? Mrs. Rosa moved closer to her children, seeking companionship and connection, yet now she felt more isolated than ever. As writer Paul Theroux once said, "Loneliness begins with family." Maybe he was onto something after all. The price of living together when love becomes a burden. Mrs. Rosa's story takes an unexpected turn. What began as a dream of family togetherness slowly unravels into a quiet nightmare. Have you ever wondered how a decision made out of love could lead you down a path you never anticipated? Lucia, Mrs. Rosa's daughter, begins to reveal her true colors. One day, while Rosa is preparing lunch, Lucia storms into the kitchen with a frown. "Mom, how many times have I told you the kids don't like onions? Why do you keep putting them in everything?" The criticism hits Rosa like a bucket of cold water. And this isn't an isolated incident. Over time, what started as gentle suggestions morph into commands, and helpful advice turns into sharp reproaches. Rosa feels her personal space shrinking, her voice growing quieter. Does any of this sound familiar? Perhaps you've experienced something similar, or maybe you know someone who has. Psychologist Erik Erikson, famous for his theory on psychosocial development, reminds us how crucial it is to maintain autonomy in old age. According to Erikson, losing one's independence can lead to an identity crisis and a sense of hopelessness. Isn't it ironic that in seeking support from our loved ones, we can sometimes lose something as precious as our very essence? Mrs. Rosa begins to feel the heavy weight of this reality. Her days, once filled with dreams and personal projects, have now been reduced to caring for her grandchildren and following her daughter's orders. Where is the woman who had plans to travel and learn new things? She seems to have faded, buried under the shadow of other people's expectations. A study from the University of Michigan found that older adults who retain their independence report significantly higher levels of life satisfaction. It makes perfect sense. Imagine how you'd feel if every aspect of your life was controlled by someone else. Frustration begins to fester in Rosa's heart. Each time she hears "you should do it like this," or "why don't you do it my way," it feels like a tiny splinter to her self-esteem. Slowly but surely, resentment, an unwelcome guest, begins to settle into the house that was once her refuge. One night, after an especially difficult day, Rosa finds herself crying softly in her room. The walls that once gave her comfort now feel like they're closing in on her. She feels trapped, worthless, like an old piece of furniture no one really values but no one bothers to throw away. How many of our elders are silently living this same drama? The paradox is heartbreaking. In seeking the warmth of her family, Mrs. Rosa has lost the fire of her own identity. The closeness that should have been a balm has instead become an invisible cage. Is there a way out of this trap? Can Mrs. Rosa regain her independence without sacrificing the love of her family? Philosopher Bertrand Russell once said, "The purpose of life is to grow not just physically, but mentally and spiritually." But how can Rosa grow when each day she feels smaller in her own home? Stay tuned to discover how an old friend steps in and changes Mrs. Rosa's life for the better. The unexpected revelation, wisdom from a lifelong friend. It was advice that would challenge everything we thought we knew about aging and family. On what seemed like an ordinary day, Carmela, Mrs. Rosa's lifelong friend, decided to drop by for a surprise visit. With her signature warm smile and a bag of freshly baked cookies in hand, Carmela rang the doorbell. But what she found on the other side left her speechless. "Rosa, is that really you?" "You look different," Carmela remarked, noting her friend's tired eyes and worn expression. Trying to mask her fatigue, Mrs. Rosa greeted her with a forced smile and invited her inside. As they sat in the kitchen, sharing coffee, Carmela couldn't help but notice the unusual clutter in her typically spotless friend's home. "Rosa, is everything all right? You seem Off, Carmela asked, her voice full of genuine concern. And that's when the dam broke, like a river spilling over its banks, Mrs. Rosa began to pour out her heart, confessing everything: her exhaustion, her frustration, and the suffocating feeling that she had lost herself in a life she no longer recognized. Carmela. Sometimes I feel like I've lost my essence, Rosa admitted tearfully. I'm no longer Rosa, I'm just Grandma. She paused, her voice trembling. I love my grandchildren, but where's the woman who dreamed of traveling, who stayed up all night reading novels? Carmela listened intently, nodding in sympathy. When Rosa finished, her friend gently took her hands and, with a knowing smile, said, Rosa dear, what if I told you that I went through the same thing and found a solution that changed everything? Rosa's eyes widened in surprise. You? But you always seem so happy, so free, she exclaimed, disbelief written all over her face. Carmela chuckled softly. Oh, it wasn't always like this. Remember when my kids convinced me to move in with them? Well, after 6 months I realized I was making the biggest mistake of my life. And with that, Carmela began to share her own experience, how, just like Rosa, she had lost her independence, her hobbies, her very sense of self. But one day, she continued, I remembered something the philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson once said: the only person you are destined to become is the person you decide to be. And I decided it was time to be myself again. Mrs. Rosa listened, captivated, as Carmela recounted the courageous decision she made to move back into her own apartment. It wasn't easy, Carmela admitted. At first, my kids didn't understand. But you know what? Over time, our relationship actually got better. They stopped seeing me as a burden or a free babysitter and started seeing me again as their mother, an independent and happy woman. But don't you feel lonely sometimes? Rosa interrupted, concern etched on her face. Carmela smiled. Of course there are moments, but as the psychologist Carl Jung said, loneliness doesn't come from having no one around, it comes from being unable to express what's important to you. And let me tell you, since I regained my independence, my conversations with my children and grandchildren have become so much more meaningful and fulfilling. Carmela's words struck a deep chord in Rosa, as if someone had flicked on a light in the dark, revealing a new path she never knew existed. True happiness, Carmela went on, comes from living your own life, finding that healthy balance between being there for your family and making time for yourself. She paused and added, did you know that recent studies have shown that older adults who maintain their independence have better mental and physical health? Rosa shook her head, intrigued by this new revelation. Well, it's true, Carmela said confidently. A study published in the Journal of Gerontology found that older adults who live independently report higher life satisfaction and lower rates of depression. They even have stronger immune systems. Mrs. Rosa sat in quiet reflection, processing everything she had just learned. After a long moment, a mix of fear and excitement edged into her voice as she asked, but, Carmela, how do I start? I'm afraid of hurting my daughter, my grandchildren. The awakening, rediscovering the power of independence. Before we dive back into the story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, along with the bell, so you never miss future videos. If you enjoy content like this as much as I do, leave a comment saying I love these stories and share what you'd like to see next. I read every comment. Let's continue learning and growing together. With a gentle squeeze of her hand, Carmela smiled warmly at Rosa and said, true love isn't about control. Your children will love you more when they see how happy you are being yourself. She advised Rosa to take small steps, join that painting class she'd always dreamed of, take a morning walk by herself. Slowly but surely she could reclaim her space and rediscover her independence. And so, with a lukewarm cup of coffee in her hand, but a heart brimming with newfound hope, Mrs. Rosa confronted a challenge she hadn't foreseen: reevaluating her life and learning to value her independence. Carmela's visit hadn't just brought cookies, it had also planted the seed of a new beginning. Mrs. Rosa found herself at an emotional crossroads. On one side, she deeply loved her family, but on the other, she felt like she was fading away as a person. It was then that she recalled the wise words of the philosopher Seneca: life is long if you know how to use it. And she began to wonder, was she truly living, or merely existing? One morning, while preparing breakfast for her grandchildren, a moment of clarity struck her. She remembered her passion for painting, a love she had let slip away years ago. When was the last time she held a paintbrush? She couldn't even recall. That very same day, she made a small but profound decision: she would reclaim her independence, starting with something as simple as a solitary walk in the park. At first, she felt guilty for not being home to help, but soon, that daily hour of solitude became a refreshing oasis. During her walks, Mrs. Rosa reflected on her forgotten dreams and began plotting how she would revive them. Her next step was even bolder. She signed up for a painting class for seniors at the community center. What if I'd forgotten how to paint, she thought nervously. But as Pablo Picasso once said, inspiration exists, but it has to find you working. And find her it did. In that workshop, Mrs. Rosa not only reignited her love for art, but also made new friends. Amid brushstrokes and laughter, she realized she had been living on autopilot, forgetting that life at any age is filled with endless possibilities. A Harvard University study revealed that maintaining independence in old age not only boosts mental health but can even increase life expectancy by up to 5 years. Mrs. Rosa was living proof of that. With each new activity, with every personal choice she made, she felt herself come alive again. But the journey wasn't always smooth. There were days when guilt crept in. Am I being selfish, she would ask herself. Yet, she remembered Carmela's wise words, you can't pour from an empty cup. Taking care of herself wasn't selfish, it was essential if she was to continue caring for those she loved. As Mrs. Rosa embraced her independence, remarkable changes followed. Her energy levels rose, her chronic aches lessened, and even her memory improved. Dr. Oliver Sacks, a renowned neurologist and writer, once said, "The brain is the most remarkable organ. It adapts, transforms, and reshapes itself with each new experience." And so, with every new adventure, Mrs. Rosa was reshaping not just her mind, but her life. But the most profound transformation came in her relationship with her family. Ironically, by spending less time with them, the moments they did share became more meaningful. She was no longer the tired, complaining grandmother. She had become a vibrant woman with stories to tell and experiences to share. Finally, Mrs. Rosa gathered the courage for a crucial conversation with her daughter. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she also knew it was necessary. As the poet Maya Angelou once said, there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside you. And Mrs. Rosa had so much she needed to say. The difficult conversation breaking the cycle of dependency. With her heart racing, Mrs. Rosa took a deep breath and sat across from her daughter. "Lucia, darling, we need to talk," she began, her voice trembling. Lucia looked at her, curious, having no idea what was coming next. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," Mrs. Rosa continued, "and I believe it's time for me to move into my own place." The silence that followed was deafening. Lucia blinked several times, as if trying to process the words she had just heard. "But Mom," Lucia stammered, "why? Aren't you comfortable here? Did we do something wrong?" Her voice wavered, a mix of concern and guilt surfacing. Mrs. Rosa gave her a gentle smile. "No, sweetheart, you've all been wonderful. But I need to rediscover myself. To have my own space," she thought of the philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre's words, "man is condemned to be free." And at 70, she was choosing that freedom. Lucia's expression shifted from shock to confusion, and then settled into a bittersweet mixture of sadness and understanding. "But Mom, will you be okay alone? What if you get sick?" she asked, her eyes filled with worry. Taking her daughter's hands, Mrs. Rosa spoke softly but firmly. "Lucia, I'm not saying I'm disappearing. I just need a place of my own, a space where I can grow and enjoy this stage of my life." She recalled a study from the University of Michigan, which found that older adults who maintain their independence report higher life satisfaction. "But what about the kids?" Lucia asked, her voice tinged with desperation. "They love having you here." Mrs. Rosa smiled warmly. "I love being with them too. But you know what? I think I'll be a better grandmother if I have time for myself." She thought of writer Anne Morrow Lindbergh's words, "The most exquisite of human pleasures is to be loved, but to be loved freely, without obligation." Lucia fell silent, absorbing everything her mother had said. After a moment, with tears welling in her eyes, she finally nodded. "You're right, Mom. We'll miss you so much, though." "And I'll miss you all too," Mrs. Rosa replied, wrapping her daughter in a warm hug. "But just think of all the delicious meals I'll make when you come visit without anyone telling me I'm using too much salt." They both laughed, easing the tension that had built up between them. Family psychologist Dr. Maria Elena Rodriguez emphasizes that while conversations like these are difficult, they are essential for maintaining healthy relationships between parents and their adult children. Open, honest communication strengthens family bonds, even when it involves significant changes, she explains. As the conversation continued, Lucia began to see things from her mother's perspective. I suppose we all need our own space, she reflected. You've spent so many years taking care of us. Mrs. Rosa nodded, grateful for her daughter's understanding. Exactly. And now it's time for me to take care of myself, she said. Recalling the poet Rumi's words, yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. Today I am wise, so I am changing myself. Lucia smiled, a blend of pride and nostalgia flickering in her eyes. Well, Mom, I guess we'll just have to help you find the perfect apartment, one with a kitchen big enough for all your secret recipes. And with a balcony for my plants, Mrs. Rosa added, her face lighting up with excitement. The rebirth, a new chapter in Mrs. Rosa's life. As Mrs. Rosa stepped across the threshold of her new apartment, she was filled with a blend of excitement and nerves. Am I making the right choice? She wondered. But then she remembered the words of psychologist Carl Jung, I am not what happened to me, I am what I choose to become. And Mrs. Rosa had chosen to be courageous. Decorating her new space became an unexpected form of therapy. Every object she placed was a statement of her reclaimed identity. The vibrant rug she had always loved but her daughter found too bold, the paintings of her favorite artist now brightening her walls, and even a daring decision to paint one wall a striking turquoise. Oh, if only Ramon could see me now, she chuckled, thinking fondly of her late husband. But Mrs. Rosa's true rebirth began when she ventured beyond her comfort zone. She signed up for a gardening workshop at the community center. Plants and grandmothers, what a cliché, she thought with a smile. That's where she met Mrs. Consuelo, a widow with a sharp sense of humor who quickly became her partner in adventure. Together they embraced the idea of active aging, not just staying busy but living with purpose. As the World Health Organization notes, active aging helps people realize their physical, social, and mental potential throughout their lives. Inspired by this, Mrs. Rosa and Mrs. Consuelo decided to try yoga. Their first session was a hilarious disaster. I felt like a twisted pretzel, Mrs. Rosa joked, but they kept at it. Soon, they noticed improvements in their flexibility and balance. More importantly, they laughed like they hadn't in years. One afternoon, as they sipped coffee after class, Mrs. Consuelo turned to her and said, Rosa, have you noticed we don't complain about our aches and pains anymore? It was true. They were so caught up in living that they'd forgotten to focus on aging. The Roman philosopher Seneca once said, life is like a play, it's not how long it is, but how well it's performed. Mrs. Rosa was determined to make her second act her best yet. She took more chances. She joined a book club, reigniting her love for poetry, and even began writing her own verses, something she hadn't done since she was young. The wrinkles on paper are much less noticeable than on my face, she joked with her new friends. But the most profound change came in her relationship with her family. Paradoxically, by having her own space, visits from her children and grandchildren became more special, less of a duty and more of a shared joy. One Sunday, as her eldest granddaughter helped her water the plants on her tiny balcony, Mrs. Rosa had a revelation. Not only had she regained her independence, but she was also imparting an invaluable lesson to the younger generation how to age with dignity and joy. The paradox of love, Mrs. Rosa realized, is that sometimes a little distance is the secret ingredient to strengthening bonds. The paradox of love, how distance strengthens bonds. When Mrs. Rosa decided to move into her own apartment, many people thought she was making a mistake. How can you live alone at your age, they asked. But with a playful grin, she replied, alone. I have more of a social life now than most influencers. And she wasn't exaggerating. The physical distance between Mrs. Rosa and her family became like an elastic band, stretching the bond but ultimately making it stronger. Visits from her grandchildren turned into exciting adventures, no longer the monotonous afternoons in front of the TV, but instead filled with laughter and exploration. One day, the grandkids arrived to find Mrs. Rosa in the middle of a giant canvas. "Grandma, you look like Picasso," exclaimed little Mateo. With paint splattered even on her eyebrows, Mrs. Rosa chuckled. "Picasso. He's small compared to me. Call me the Great Rosas." That afternoon, between brushstrokes and bursts of laughter, they created a family masterpiece, now proudly hanging in the living room. But it wasn't just the visits that flourished. Phone calls, once brief and routine, transformed into meaningful conversations. As psychologist Carl Rogers would say, a good communicator listens not just with the ears, but with the eyes and heart. And that's exactly what was happening within Mrs. Rosa's family. Her newfound independence created a ripple effect. Her daughter, Lucia, admitted, Seeing Mom so happy and independent inspired me to revisit my own dreams. It turns out that freedom is contagious, and Mrs. Rosa's example was sowing seeds of change in her loved ones. A study from the University of Michigan found that older adults who maintain their independence report higher life satisfaction and healthier family relationships. Mrs. Rosa was living proof of this research, challenging stereotypes about aging. During one of her coffee afternoons with friends, Mrs. Rosa reflected, I used to think that love meant being together all the time. Now I realize that true love allows space to grow. Her words echoed the wisdom of poet Khalil Gibran, who said, leave space in your togetherness. The paradox of love that Mrs. Rosa had uncovered was simple sometimes. Stepping away is what truly brings people closer. As philosopher Erich Fromm once noted, mature love says, I need you because I love you. It doesn't say, I love you because I need you. Mrs. Rosa had moved from a stifling dependency to a healthy, interdependent love. This shift not only benefited her but everyone around her. Her grandchildren now enjoyed time with her in 2 loving homes. Her children felt less pressure and more appreciation. And Mrs. Rosa herself was thriving, embracing her new life with joy. It was as if they had unlocked the secret recipe for a happy family. And ironically, the key ingredient was a little distance. The wisdom of balance, finding the middle ground. Mrs. Rosa discovered something profound in an unexpected place somewhere between 2 extremes. As the Greek philosopher Aristotle once said, virtue lies in the middle, and Mrs. Rosa experienced this truth firsthand. After her epiphany and brave decision to reclaim her independence, a new challenge emerged. How could she nurture a close relationship with her family without sacrificing the freedom she had so recently regained? The answer, as with many of life's great truths, was simple yet far from easy balance. Mrs. Rosa came to understand that the key to harmony was healthy interdependence, a concept American psychologist Stephen Covey described as the fusion of independence and dependence. In practice, this meant Mrs. Rosa had to establish clear yet flexible boundaries. For instance, she agreed to babysit her grandchildren 2 afternoons a week, but she reserved the remaining time for her own pursuits. It's like juggling, she would joke, but instead of balls, I'm balancing love, freedom, and responsibility. This newfound approach had an unexpected impact on her family time. It became less about the endless hours of routine and more about special, meaningful moments filled with laughter and genuine connection. As the writer Mitch Albom wisely noted, death ends a life, not a relationship. Mrs. Rosa realized that the strength of her relationships depended not on the quantity of time she spent, but on the quality. Of course, the journey wasn't without its struggles. There were days when guilt crept in like a dark cloud on a bright day. During those moments, Mrs. Rosa would recall the words of psychologist Carl Jung, what you resist persists, what you accept transforms you. So instead of pushing her feelings aside, she embraced them, using them as reminders to reaffirm her choices. A University of Michigan study showed that older adults who balance independence with family support are 30% less likely to experience depression. Mrs. Rosa was living proof of this, finding that her new equilibrium not only brought her greater happiness but also improved her overall well-being. Over time, Mrs. Rosa became something of a guru among her friends at the senior support group she attended. With a mix of humor and wisdom, she shared her experiences. My dears, she would say, old age is like a fine wine. It needs space to breathe, but also the warmth of good company to bring out its true flavor. Her story inspired many to reconsider their own family dynamics. As anthropologist Margaret Mead once said, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has, and in her own little corner of the world, Mrs. Rosa was making that change, one family at a time. Perhaps the most profound transformation was in Mrs. Rosa herself. She no longer saw herself as a burden or merely a figurehead in her family's life. Instead, she was a woman with purpose, with dreams, and the energy to pursue them. As the philosopher Seneca said, it is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a lot of it. Mrs. Rosa was determined not to waste another second. Her story is a testament to how one act of self-love can ripple outwards, transforming not only the individual but those around them as well. Mrs. Rosa's legacy, a lesson in self-love and family. Mrs. Rosa's journey was not just about her own life, it became a transformative experience for her entire family. When she chose to reclaim her independence, she wasn't merely doing herself a favor, she was planting a seed of wisdom that would flourish among her loved ones. As psychologist Carl Jung famously said, the greatest impact we can have on our children is not through teaching, but by living our lives fully, and indeed, Mrs. Rosa was doing just that. Her courage created ripples of change. Her daughter, who had initially hesitated, began to see her mother in a new light. No longer just grandma, she recognized Mrs. Rosa as a woman with her own dreams and passions. This realization prompted her to reflect on her own life and question whether she was truly living on her own terms. Meanwhile, the grandchildren were now blessed with a grandmother brimming with fascinating stories. Their eyes sparkled with excitement as Mrs. Rosa shared her new paintings and recounted her adventures in the art studio. Unbeknownst to them, they were absorbing a vital lesson about the value of independence and the importance of continuous personal growth. Yet Mrs. Rosa's legacy transcends her immediate family. It encourages all of us to examine our own family dynamics. Are we honoring the personal space of our loved ones, or are we unintentionally stifling them with our expectations? Philosopher Khalil Gibran wisely noted, "Your children are not your children. They are the sons and daughters of life." Longing for itself, Mrs. Rosa recognized that the same principle applies to parents. We are not our children's possessions. We are individuals entitled to live our own lives. So, dear viewer, I urge you to ask yourself, are you truly living your life, or merely the life that others expect from you? Remember, it's never too late to start anew. If you've always wanted to take that motorcycle trip, go for it. Just don't forget to invite me along. Life is too short to be paralyzed by fear. Step outside your comfort zone and embrace experiences that challenge you. This is how we grow and learn. As the great Gadates said, whatever you can do or dream you can do, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it, so take that leap, be bold, and be yourself. The greatest gift you can offer your family is your own happiness. If you've made it this far, drop a comment saying, "Water is powerful, so I know who the true champions are who stuck around until the end." Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more content like this in the future. Share this video with your loved ones so they can embrace this wisdom today. Consider supporting the channel by becoming a member. Not only will you be contributing financially, but you'll also enjoy exclusive benefits. I'll leave the link in the pinned comment for you to explore. Thank you for your support. Now click on this video to continue feeding your mind with wisdom. Sending a big hug, and until next time.